The airport buzzed with the usual chaos. Passengers hurrying to their gates, flight announcements echoing through the terminals, and the rhythmic beeping of luggage scanners filling the air. Among the crowd, an elderly couple walked side by side, their hands lightly brushing against each other as they moved toward their boarding gate. Their steps were slow, deliberate, yet there was a quiet grace in the way they carried themselves. Margaret and Henry Dawson had been together for more than 5 decades. Through the years, they had built a life full of love, laughter, and unforgettable journeys. This trip was supposed to be just another one of those moments, another adventure to add to their cherished memories. They had booked first-class seats on this flight, a small luxury they allowed themselves in their golden years. All they wanted was to sit together, side by side, just as they had for the past 50 years. As they approached the boarding area, Margaret tightened her grip on Henry's arm. "I hope we got the seats next to each other like we requested," she said softly, a hint of worry in her voice. Henry gave her a reassuring smile. "Of course, darling. We made sure of that when we booked the tickets." When their boarding group was called, they slowly made their way onto the plane, exchanging polite smiles with the flight attendants as they stepped inside. The cabin was pristine, the smell of fresh leather and subtle hints of perfume filling the air. A young flight attendant, her uniform perfectly pressed, stood near the first-class section, checking boarding passes with a professional smile. Margaret handed over their tickets, expecting the usual nod of approval. Instead, the flight attendant's expression shifted. She furrowed her brows, looking from the tickets to the couple. "I'm sorry, but your seats aren't together," she said briskly. "One of you is in 2A, and the other is in 4C. Margaret's heart sank. "There must be a mistake," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "We booked our seats together. My husband and I always sit next to each other." The flight attendant let out a small sigh, as if this was just another inconvenience in her already busy day. "I understand, ma'am, but there's nothing I can do. The seating arrangement is final." Henry, ever the gentleman, offered a polite smile. "Perhaps there's been a mix-up. Would it be possible to switch our seats?" The attendant shook her head. "I'm afraid that's not allowed. You'll have to take your assigned seats." Margaret's fingers tightened around her handbag. She wasn't one to make a fuss, but this was important to her. "Please," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We don't travel often anymore. It would mean a lot to us." The flight attendant's expression remained indifferent. "Rules are rules," she said curtly, before turning her attention to the next passenger in line. A few nearby passengers overheard the exchange, some casting sympathetic glances, while others simply ignored the situation. Margaret and Henry stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The joy of their journey had suddenly been replaced with an uncomfortable tension. With a heavy sigh, Henry squeezed Margaret's hand. "It's all right, dear. We'll manage." Margaret forced a smile, but deep down, she felt a sting of disappointment. It wasn't just about the seats, it was about being together. After all these years, even a few hours apart felt wrong. As they made their way to their separate seats, the flight attendant didn't realize she had just dismissed 2 people far more important than she could have imagined. Because what she didn't know, what no one on that plane knew, was that Margaret and Henry Dawson weren't just any elderly couple. They owned the airline. And soon, that flight attendant would learn a lesson she would never forget. Margaret settled into her seat with a quiet sigh, glancing toward the row where Henry had been assigned. The distance between them wasn't much, just a few steps apart, but it felt farther than it should. She had spent her entire life beside him, every morning, every night, through every joy and every hardship. Being separated now, even for a few hours, felt strangely unsettling. Henry gave her a reassuring smile from his seat, lifting his hand in a small wave. She knew he was trying to make the best of it, not wanting to cause a scene. That was just the kind of man he was. Patient, kind, always willing to let things go. But Margaret could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes too. The flight attendant who had dismissed them earlier continued assisting other passengers, her posture straight, her tone clipped and professional. She barely glanced at Margaret again as she helped a younger couple find their seats. Margaret wasn't one to hold grudges, but something about the way the attendant had spoken to them, so dismissively, so coldly, sat uncomfortably in her chest. She turned toward the window, watching as the last few passengers trickled in, placing their bags in the overhead compartments and settling into their seats. The hum of conversation filled the cabin, along with the occasional chime from the intercom. A businessman across the aisle typed furiously on his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard. A young mother struggled to calm her fussy toddler a few rows ahead. Everything felt normal. Just another routine flight. Except for Margaret and Henry, it wasn't. She thought back to all the years they had spent building the airline from the ground up. It had started as a dream, something they had poured their hearts, their savings, and their entire lives into. Long nights, endless sacrifices, moments of doubt, but they had done it. They had built something lasting. And now, they no longer ran the day-to-day operations, but their influence still lingered in every part of the company. Their names might not have been plastered on the walls, but they were there, woven into every decision, every policy, every flight that took off under their banner. Yet, here they were, treated like just another set of passengers. Margaret's gaze drifted back to the flight attendant, who was now chatting with a co-worker near the front of the cabin. She seemed completely unaware that the people she had just dismissed were the very reason she had a job. It wasn't about power or status for Margaret. She didn't care about being recognized. But there was something deeply wrong about how she and Henry had been treated, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a simple seating mistake. A gentle voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss," an older man seated next to her said softly. "I couldn't help but overhear earlier. You and your husband, would you like to switch seats?" "I don't mind moving." Margaret turned to look at him, touched by the kindness in his offer. He was probably in his 70s, dressed in a simple navy sweater, his silver hair neatly combed back. His eyes held a warmth that reminded her of Henry's. "That's very kind of you," Margaret said, offering him a grateful smile. "But I wouldn't want to inconvenience you." The man waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense. My wife passed a few years ago, and I know how precious time together is. I'd be happy to switch." Margaret's heart ached at his words. She glanced toward Henry again, seeing him adjusting his seatbelt, unaware of the conversation happening just a few feet away. For a brief moment, she considered accepting the offer, but then her gaze drifted back to the flight attendant. Would she allow it? Or would she insist on enforcing the rules, just to prove a point? Margaret didn't want to cause trouble, but something told her this situation wasn't just about rules. There had been something in the attendant's tone earlier, something dismissive, almost condescending. Margaret wasn't sure if it was ageism, classism, or just a bad attitude, but it didn't sit right with her. "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice gentle. "But I think I'll wait and see how this plays out." The man gave her a knowing look but didn't press further. The flight attendants soon moved through the aisles, ensuring everything was in place before takeoff. The lead attendant, a woman in her late 30s with a polished demeanor, stood at the front and greeted the passengers. Her voice was smooth, professional, and welcoming, everything that the younger flight attendants had lacked. As the safety demonstration began, Margaret felt a shift in the air. Henry caught her eye again, giving her a wink as if to say, "We'll be fine, darling. Let's just get through the flight." Margaret smiled back, but deep down, something told her this wasn't over. As the engines roared to life and the plane began taxiing down the runway, Margaret let her fingers rest lightly on the armrest, her mind racing. The young flight attendant had made a mistake, one that she had no idea she'd made. And soon, she would realize that sometimes, the people you overlook are the ones who hold all the power. As the plane lifted off, Margaret felt the familiar sensation of weightlessness pressing her back into the seat. She exhaled slowly, glancing at Henry again. He was leaning slightly toward the aisle, his eyes meeting hers with a reassuring warmth. They had been through so much together. Years of hard work, sacrifices, victories, and struggles. But this moment, this small injustice, felt heavier than it should have. The young flight attendant, the one who had so curtly dismissed their request, moved briskly through the first-class cabin, checking that seatbelts were fastened and trays were upright. Margaret watched her carefully, noting the way she interacted with different passengers. She was polite enough, but there was something about her manner that felt selective. Her tone was warmer when she spoke to the younger, well-dressed passengers, and slightly dismissive when dealing with the older ones. Margaret frowned. Was this just a matter of attitude, or was there something deeper? Across the aisle, a businessman in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit, snapped his fingers to get the attendant's attention. "Excuse me," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "Can I get a glass of champagne?" The flight attendant's demeanor shifted instantly. Her lips curved into a pleasant smile, her tone brightened. "Of course, sir. I'll bring it right over." Margaret watched the exchange closely. The young woman didn't seem bothered at all by his dismissive tone. In fact, she responded with a level of attentiveness she certainly hadn't shown Margaret and Henry. A moment later, another passenger, an elderly woman with neatly styled gray hair, pressed her call button. The flight attendant walked over, her smile noticeably dimmer. "Yes. Would it be possible to get a blanket?" "It's a bit chilly," the older woman asked, her voice soft but polite. The attendant sighed, as if the request was somehow an inconvenience. "I'll check," she said, then walked away without another word. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She exchanged a glance with the elderly man sitting beside her, the one who had offered to switch seats earlier. He had seen it too. He gave her a knowing nod as if to say, "You're not imagining things." As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, the lead flight attendant, the polished woman who had given the announcements earlier, made her way down the aisle, greeting passengers warmly. She paused near Margaret's seat, giving her a friendly smile. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Margaret hesitated for a moment. She wasn't one to complain, but something about the way she and Henry had been treated didn't sit right with her. "Actually," she said carefully, "there was a bit of a mix-up with our seating. My husband and I booked our tickets together, but we were assigned separate seats." The lead attendant frowned slightly. "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Let me check your reservation." Margaret handed over her ticket, and the attendant examined it closely. Her brow furrowed. "You're right. It does show that your seats were originally together. I'm not sure why they were changed." Margaret cast a glance toward the younger flight attendant, who was now engaged in conversation with another passenger, oblivious to the discussion happening nearby. "I asked if we could switch, but she said it wasn't allowed," Margaret added, keeping her tone even. The lead attendant's expression shifted, just slightly. "That's unusual. We always try to accommodate seating requests, especially for couples traveling together." She glanced toward Henry, who was sitting quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He caught her looking and smiled politely. The lead attendant straightened. "Let me see if I can fix this." She walked toward the front of the cabin, stopping to speak in hushed tones with another crew member. Margaret watched as their conversation played out. The other attendant nodded, checked something on a tablet, then gestured toward the younger flight attendant, the one who had refused to move their seats. Margaret saw the young woman's posture stiffen slightly. She gave a quick, dismissive shake of her head. The lead attendant's lips pressed into a firm line. After another brief exchange, she returned to Margaret's seat. "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience," she said, her tone calm but professional. "It looks like there was a manual adjustment to your seating. I'm going to correct that now." Margaret tilted her head. "A manual adjustment?" The attendant hesitated. "It seems, your seats were changed after booking, but not due to any system error. I'll make sure you and your husband are seated together right away." Margaret's mind raced. The seats hadn't been moved by accident. Someone had changed them on purpose. But why? As the lead attendant turned to address Henry's seating, Margaret noticed the younger flight attendant watching from a distance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. There was something in her expression, something that looked a lot like resentment. Margaret suddenly had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just about airline policies. There was more to this, and she intended to find out exactly what it was. Margaret watched as the lead flight attendant made her way toward Henry's seat, speaking in a hushed but firm tone. Henry, ever the gentleman, simply nodded, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stood up to move beside her. As he took his rightful seat next to Margaret, he leaned in and whispered, "Looks like someone finally decided to do the right thing." Margaret gave him a small smile, but her mind was elsewhere. She could still feel the weight of the younger flight attendant's glare from across the cabin. The woman's arms were still crossed, her posture rigid, as if she had just been publicly challenged and didn't appreciate losing. Margaret wasn't sure what had driven her to separate them in the first place, but now she had an uneasy feeling that this wasn't over. The quiet hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane cruised at altitude. Passengers around them were settling in, some watching movies, others reading or dozing off. Everything should have felt normal now, but Margaret could sense an undercurrent of tension. The young flight attendant moved through the aisle, still performing her duties, but there was something clipped about her movements. Each time she passed by Margaret and Henry, her eyes barely flickered in their direction. Henry must have sensed Margaret's unease because he reached for her hand and gave it a light squeeze. "Don't let it get to you," he murmured. "We're together now. That's what matters." Margaret nodded, but something inside her told her this was far from settled. A few moments later, the younger flight attendant returned to their row. Without looking directly at them, she reached over and placed 2 glasses of champagne on their tray table. "Compliments of the airline," she said flatly, her voice devoid of warmth. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That's very kind of you." The woman didn't respond. She turned sharply and walked away, her posture stiff. Margaret watched as she disappeared toward the galley. Henry took a sip of the champagne and let out a small chuckle. "I think that's her way of saying she's sorry." Margaret wasn't so sure. Something still felt off. She had dealt with difficult people before. Years of running a business had taught her how to read people. This wasn't simple regret or embarrassment. The flight attendant wasn't apologetic. She was angry. And Margaret didn't believe for a second that the champagne was an act of goodwill. It was more like a forced gesture, something she had been instructed to do rather than something she had chosen to do. Minutes passed, and Margaret tried to relax. The flight was quiet. The lights had dimmed slightly as some passengers prepared to rest. But then, she noticed something strange. The young flight attendant was speaking in hushed tones with a male crew member near the front of the first-class cabin. They were angled away from her, but Margaret could still see the tension in their body language. The young woman was gesturing subtly in her direction, her expression unreadable. The male attendant gave a small nod, then walked off toward the back of the plane. Margaret's pulse quickened. Was she imagining things, or was something deliberate happening here? She turned to Henry, lowering her voice. "Did you see that?" Henry followed her gaze, watching the crew members carefully. "I did." Margaret leaned in closer. "She's still upset. But why? What does she have against us?" Henry exhaled through his nose. "Could be pride. Some people don't like being corrected, especially in front of their peers." Margaret thought about that. It was possible, but something told her it was deeper than that. Then, without warning, the plane hit a sudden patch of turbulence. It wasn't the normal, mild shake. It was sharp, abrupt. A few gasps rippled through the cabin as passengers instinctively gripped their armrests. Margaret and Henry braced themselves as the aircraft jolted again. The intercom chimed, and the captain's voice came on, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Flight attendants moved swiftly, checking that everything was secure. But Margaret noticed something strange. The young flight attendant had vanished. She wasn't assisting. She wasn't checking seatbelts. She was gone. Margaret's heart began to pound. She glanced toward the front of the plane, then toward the galley. Where had she gone? Henry noticed her expression. "What is it?" Margaret shook her head. "Something's not right." Before Henry could respond, the male flight attendant, the one the young woman had spoken to earlier, appeared at the front of the cabin. His expression was calm, but Margaret saw the way his eyes flickered toward her and Henry, then quickly away. Then, as if nothing had happened, he moved toward another passenger and spoke in a hushed voice. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening behind the scenes. She had spent years trusting her instincts in business, and right now, they were screaming at her that something wasn't adding up. She turned back to Henry. "I think we need to be very careful." Henry frowned. "What are you thinking?" Margaret glanced around, lowering her voice further. "I don't know yet, but I think this is bigger than just a seating issue." Henry studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right. We stay alert." The turbulence finally settled, but the tension in the air remained. And Margaret knew, deep in her bones, that something was coming. Margaret kept her gaze steady as she observed the movements of the flight crew. Something was happening behind the scenes, something subtle but deliberate. She could feel it. Henry shifted beside her, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest, a habit she recognized as his way of staying composed when deep in thought. He had caught on too. The younger flight attendant had still not returned, and Margaret found that strange. The turbulence had settled, yet she was nowhere to be seen. The male crew member, the one who had exchanged glances with her before, continued to move through the cabin, but Margaret noticed that he avoided making direct eye contact with her or Henry. Then, just as she was about to lean over and whisper to Henry again, something unexpected happened. A passenger, a man in his mid-50s sitting just a few rows ahead, abruptly stood up. His expression was tense, and his breathing seemed uneven. He hesitated for a moment before glancing toward the first-class galley, then back toward the economy section behind them, as if debating something in his mind. The lead flight attendant, the one who had helped correct their seats earlier, immediately approached him. "Sir, is everything all right?" The man's hand hovered near his chest for a second, then dropped to his side. He nodded stiffly. I just need a moment. Can I step into the galley?" The attendant's brow furrowed. "Sir, I can assist you here if you're feeling unwell." The man shook his head quickly. "No, it's fine. He exhaled, his eyes darting to Margaret and Henry for just a second before he turned toward the galley door. Margaret didn't miss the glance. It was brief, but there was something behind it. Urgency. Recognition, maybe? But how would this man recognize them? The male flight attendant who had been avoiding them was suddenly at the man's side, ushering him toward the galley. The lead attendant hesitated for just a second before stepping aside, though her expression showed concern. Margaret felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Something about the way this was playing out felt orchestrated, controlled. Henry leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see the way he looked at us?" Margaret gave a tiny nod. "I did. Do you think he knows something?" Margaret wasn't sure. But before she could respond, the curtain to the galley was pulled shut, concealing both the man and the two flight attendants from view. Her fingers gripped the armrest as her mind raced. What was going on? The young flight attendant's unusual behavior, the seating change, the hushed conversations, and now this passenger acting strangely, it was all connected. She was sure of it. Then, another realization hit her. The cockpit door was near the galley. Margaret's pulse quickened. Was that why the man had asked to go back there? Was he connected to the flight crew in some way? Or worse, was he planning something? She looked at Henry, and she could see the same thought flashing through his mind. He reached for her hand again, but this time, it wasn't just reassurance. It was a silent agreement. We need to stay alert. A few minutes passed. The curtain remained closed. The rest of the cabin continued as if nothing was wrong, but Margaret could feel the shift in the air. Then, just as suddenly as he had disappeared, the passenger re-emerged. But he was alone. The flight attendants did not follow him out. Margaret sat up straighter. That wasn't right. If he had simply needed assistance, they would have walked him back to his seat. Instead, he returned quietly, sitting down with an unreadable expression. Henry whispered, "Where did they go?" Margaret's eyes darted toward the galley curtain, still unmoving. Then, as if on cue, the young flight attendant suddenly appeared again, stepping back into the cabin. She smoothed her uniform, her expression carefully neutral, but Margaret saw the slight tension in her jaw. The male crew member followed a few moments later, giving a quick glance toward the lead flight attendant, who was now at the far end of the cabin. Margaret's heart pounded. Something had just happened back there. The plane was still cruising smoothly. Everything on the surface seemed fine. But Margaret knew this was the moment before the storm. The moment when everything was about to come to light. And whatever it was, she and Henry were at the center of it. Margaret's pulse was steady, but her mind raced. She had been in high-stakes situations before. Running an airline meant constantly navigating crises, but this was different. This was personal. She exchanged a glance with Henry, and she could tell he was thinking the same thing. Something was unfolding around them, something deliberate. And now, it was time to find out what. The young flight attendant returned to the aisle, her movements precise but controlled. Margaret noticed the way her gaze flickered toward the man who had stepped into the galley earlier. He sat stiffly in his seat, staring straight ahead, his hands clasped together. He was waiting for something. Margaret made a decision. She wasn't going to sit back and let this happen. Whatever this was. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Immediately, the male flight attendant, who had been watching from the far end of the cabin, took a step forward. His lips parted as if he were about to say something, but before he could, the lead flight attendant, the one who had originally helped her and Henry, spoke up instead. "Mrs. Langford." Margaret turned to face her, noting the slight tension in her voice. "Yes." The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the galley, then back to Margaret. It was subtle, but Margaret caught the message. Something had happened back there. Margaret took a slow breath. "I'd like to speak to the captain." A ripple of surprise crossed the woman's face. "Mrs. Langford, is something wrong?" Henry stood up beside Margaret, his voice calm but firm. "We've been in this business a long time. We know when something isn't right." For a brief moment, the cabin was silent. Then, before anyone could respond, the young flight attendant let out an exasperated breath. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. Margaret turned her attention to her, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Is it?" The woman's lips pressed together, and for the first time, Margaret saw it, the crack in her confidence. A flicker of doubt. The lead flight attendant stepped closer. "Mrs. Langford," she said again, this time softer. "Perhaps you and Mr. Langford would be more comfortable speaking privately." Margaret glanced at Henry. He gave the tiniest nod. They followed the lead flight attendant toward the galley. The moment they stepped behind the curtain, Margaret felt the shift in atmosphere. It was quieter, more enclosed. The hum of the engines was the only constant sound. And then, the truth unraveled. The lead flight attendant exhaled. "I need to tell you something. That young woman," she glanced toward the curtain, "she doesn't know who you are." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And?" The woman hesitated. She's been trying to impress someone. The man in 3A. Margaret stilled. The passenger? The attendant nodded. He's a senior executive at an airline we've been in negotiations with for months. She thought if she handled this flight perfectly, if she showed authority, she might secure an opportunity with them. That's why she was so insistent about the seating earlier. She wanted to prove she could make tough decisions, no matter who was involved. Margaret let out a breath. So this was all about power? Yes. The woman glanced down, her expression frustrated. She wanted to make a point, but she didn't realize who she was dealing with. And now, I think she's worried about the consequences. Margaret and Henry exchanged glances. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, Henry let out a quiet chuckle. All of this over a job opportunity? Margaret sighed. People make foolish choices when they're desperate to be noticed. The lead flight attendant nodded. I wanted you to hear the truth directly before it escalated any further. She knows she's in trouble now. Margaret folded her arms. We didn't come on this flight looking for trouble, but she made it very clear that she didn't think we belonged in first class. The woman hesitated before nodding. I know, and I won't excuse her actions. She should have treated you like any other valued passenger. But it wasn't personal, she just didn't know better. Margaret considered that for a moment. The anger she had felt earlier wasn't gone, but it had shifted. This wasn't some grand conspiracy. It wasn't about malice. It was about ambition, misdirected and poorly executed. Henry exhaled. So what do we do now? Margaret thought for a moment, then met the lead attendant's gaze. I want to speak to her. Alone. A few minutes later, the young flight attendant stood in front of Margaret in the quiet of the galley, her hands clasped tightly. She had lost the rigid posture from earlier. She looked nervous. Margaret studied her for a long moment before speaking. You didn't know who we were. The woman swallowed. No, ma'am. And yet, you made a decision that you knew would cause unnecessary discomfort to an elderly couple. She flinched at the words. She hesitated. I thought I was doing the right thing. Margaret tilted her head. For whom? The woman didn't answer. Margaret sighed. Look, I've been in this industry for a long time. I've seen people work their way up, and I've seen people crash before they ever take off. You want a future in aviation. The woman nodded quickly. Then let me tell you something, Margaret continued, her voice calm but firm. It's not about proving you can make hard decisions. It's about making the right decisions. The ones that serve your passengers, your crew, and your company with dignity. The woman's gaze dropped. Margaret softened her tone. You made a mistake today. But the bigger mistake would be not learning from it. The flight attendant swallowed, then nodded. I understand. Margaret studied her for another moment before finally stepping back. Then consider this a lesson. And don't make me regret letting it end here. The young woman looked up, eyes wide. You're not. No, Margaret shook her head. I won't be filing a complaint. But I will be watching to see what kind of flight attendant you become from here on out. The woman nodded quickly. Thank you. Thank you. Margaret didn't respond. She simply turned and stepped back into the main cabin, Henry waiting for her. As she settled into her seat, Henry leaned in. Feel better? Margaret sighed. I suppose we'll see. Henry chuckled. You just changed her whole career, you know. Margaret gave him a small smile. Then let's hope she makes something good of it. The rest of the flight was quiet. The young flight attendant carried out her duties with a noticeable shift in attitude. Humble, careful, professional. And as the plane began its descent, Margaret leaned back, watching the clouds drift past the window, knowing that sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't the ones you teach with authority. They're the ones you teach with wisdom. As the plane made its final descent, the cabin was filled with the usual rustling of passengers preparing for landing, the soft clicks of seat belts tightening, the gentle hum of conversation, and the distant voice of the captain announcing their arrival time. Margaret watched the young flight attendant move carefully down the aisle, her posture noticeably different from before. There was no arrogance in her step now, no forced authority. Instead, she moved with quiet professionalism, ensuring that passengers were ready for landing. Margaret wasn't one to hold grudges. She had built her life, and her business, on understanding people, on knowing that mistakes were inevitable but growth was a choice. The young woman had made an error in judgment, but she had also faced it head-on. That mattered more than anything else. Henry leaned toward her. "You look deep in thought." Margaret gave him a small smile. "Just thinking about how one moment can change the course of someone's future." Henry chuckled softly. "You always did have a way of turning trouble into a lesson." As the wheels touched down, Margaret felt the familiar jolt of landing, followed by the gradual slowing of the plane. Passengers shifted in their seats, some already reaching for their belongings, eager to disembark. The flight attendants moved swiftly through their final checks, and Margaret noticed that the lead attendant, the one who had pulled them aside, gave a small, approving nod in the young woman's direction. It was a quiet exchange, but it spoke volumes. As they taxied to the gate, Margaret glanced across the cabin, her eyes briefly meeting those of the man in 3A, the executive the young attendant had been trying to impress. He had remained silent throughout most of the flight, but now there was a knowing look in his gaze. Margaret wasn't sure what he was thinking, but she had a feeling he had seen enough to form his own opinion about the situation. Whether that worked in the young woman's favor or not was something only time would tell. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, the usual shuffle began. Passengers stood, stretching, reaching for overhead bins. Margaret and Henry remained seated for a moment, letting the rush pass. Then, just before they stood to leave, the young flight attendant approached. She hesitated for a second, then took a quiet breath. "Mr. and Mrs. Langford," she said, her voice steadier than before. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Margaret studied her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "For what?" "For not making an example of me," she admitted. "For giving me a chance to learn from this instead of just destroying me over it." Margaret smiled gently. "A lesson is only valuable if you take it with you. Do you plan to?" The young woman nodded. "I do." "Good," Margaret said simply. "Then make sure the next passengers you serve never feel the way we did." The woman swallowed, then nodded again before stepping aside to let them pass. As Margaret and Henry made their way toward the exit, the lead flight attendant caught Margaret's eye and gave her a respectful nod. Margaret returned it, a silent understanding passing between them. Stepping off the plane, the fresh airport air greeted them, cooler and lighter than the cabin air they had spent hours breathing. The terminal buzzed with life, passengers rushing to their next gate, families reuniting, business travelers checking their phones. It was the rhythm of travel, familiar and constant. As they walked toward the baggage claim, Henry nudged her playfully. "So, do we mention this little adventure in the next board meeting?" Margaret chuckled. "I think we'll leave this one off the agenda." Henry smirked. "Probably for the best." They collected their bags, moving through the terminal with the ease of people who had done this countless times before. The weight of the earlier conflict had lifted, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. Just as they reached the exit, Margaret's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her eyebrows raising slightly. "What is it?" Henry asked. She turned the phone toward him. It was a message from the airline's operations team. Passenger in 3A filed a report about an impressive demonstration of leadership by a young flight attendant today. He's requested a follow-up on her performance and potential future with the company. Henry let out a low whistle. "Looks like she might get that opportunity after all." Margaret smiled. Let's just hope she remembers how she got there. With that, they stepped out into the city, the hum of travel fading behind them. The world moved on, as it always did. But somewhere in the sky, on another flight, another young flight attendant was learning what it truly meant to serve.